The red dress had been waiting in my closet like a fragile hope I hadn't dared to name. I bought it 2 weeks ago, imagining just one simple moment, my son seeing me and smiling like he used to before success swept him too far away. "You look beautiful, Mom," he would say, like he once did after school plays or graduations. Moments when my presence wasn't a burden but a blessing. I arrived early at Romano's, hands folded in my lap, rehearsing how I'd pretend not to mind if he was late. At 1:00 p.m. I checked my phone. No text. At 1:12 it buzzed. But not with an apology. It was an Instagram photo. He was in New York, at Le Bernardin, arm around Carol, the woman who once shattered our family. The caption read, "Happy Mother's Day to my real mom." I stared at the screen, and in that second the red dress turned cold against my skin. He hadn't just forgotten me. He'd replaced me, and told the world, I am 63 now, a retired elementary school teacher living alone in Boston. After 30 years of teaching and raising my only son largely on my own, I had thought Mother's Day might still mean something. I slipped the red dress over my shoulders, the fabric cool and unfamiliar against my skin. In the mirror, I saw a woman who had learned to cover loneliness with carefully chosen lipstick, a neat hairstyle, a smile practiced for the benefit of others. But beneath it all was the same yearning to be seen, to be cherished just for one day. Daniel had texted me that morning, "Looking forward to lunch, Mom. Romano's at 1. Just 10 words typed quickly, I'm sure, but my heart had leapt the way it always did when his name appeared on my phone. At 36, he was every inch his father's son. Tall, ambitious, stubborn, jaw-piercing eyes. CEO of Parker Development Group in Manhattan, forever photographed at some gala or charity event, all smiles and champagne glasses. Still, I clung to that message like a promise. I packed my purse with unnecessary care, tucking in tissues, a compact mirror, even a small gift card I had bought for him. Something modest to say I was proud of him. Then I walked the 3 blocks to Romano's, a family-run Italian restaurant we had visited since he was a boy. The waiters had seen him grow from a restless child to a young man in suits. They remembered us as a pair. I arrived at 12:45, 15 minutes early, because I couldn't bear the thought of him walking in and not finding me ready waiting. The hostess greeted me with her usual warmth. "Happy Mother's Day. Just you." I nodded, adding quickly, "My son will be joining me any minute." She led me to a corner table near the window, one we'd sat at many times before, and I placed my purse beside me like a stand-in companion. The restaurant was buzzing. Children handing hand-drawn cards to teary mothers, fathers raising glasses, bouquets of roses on nearly every table. Laughter ricocheted off the walls in a way that made the room feel almost too bright. I folded the napkin on my lap, trying to ignore the weight of other people's joy pressing down on me. I checked my phone. 12:50, 12:55, 1 o'clock. I refreshed the text thread, half expecting a new message to appear, half afraid it wouldn't. The waiter passed by with bread baskets and said, "Would you like to start with something, ma'am?" I smiled tightly. "Not yet. My son should be here soon." My voice sounded steady, but my stomach was tightening into a knot I knew too well. As the minutes ticked on, I tried to steady myself by remembering the years that had brought me here. The nights I graded papers until 2 a.m. after tucking him into bed. The mornings I packed lunches while praying the child support check would arrive before the rent was due. The soccer games where I screamed myself hoarse from the sidelines even when his father never showed up. The college bills I worked summer tutoring jobs to cover. All of it blurred together into a single fragile hope that he would never doubt my love. By 1:15, the family at the table next to me was opening a jewelry box, the mother's eyes shining as her grown daughter clasped a necklace around her neck. Their joy was a mirror I didn't want to look into. I told myself Daniel was delayed Manhattan traffic, a call he couldn't get off. Successful men were busy, weren't they? I sipped water that felt heavy in my throat and stared at the empty seat across from me, willing it to be filled. The clock read 1:20. My napkin was twisted in my lap. Around me, waiters rushed by balancing trays of champagne flutes. Little kids shouted, mothers beamed. The entire city seemed to be celebrating what I lacked. For the first time that day, a tiny crack spread through my composure. I thought of the text, just 10 words. Had they meant anything, or had they been typed out of obligation sent between meetings without a thought for me? At 1:30, the waiter returned gently. "Would you like to order something just for yourself?" His voice was kind, not pitying, but it pierced me all the same. I swallowed hard, forced a smile, and nodded. "Yes, salmon, please. It's my son's favorite." The words slipped out before I could stop them, as though saying it might conjure him here, as though my order might tether me to the hope he'd still walk through that door. As the plate arrived, fragrant with lemon and herbs, I picked up my fork but couldn't taste a thing. I sat very still, surrounded by the sound of families celebrating, and realized I had become invisible in the middle of Mother's Day. The red dress that had felt like a promise now clung to me like an unanswered question. And as I looked again at the empty chair across from me, a wave of unease swept through me, stronger than I expected. Something inside me whispered, "He isn't coming." I lowered my fork, my hands trembling slightly, and stared out the window at the bright May afternoon. All around me were the sounds of love, of recognition, of belonging. And there I was alone at a table set for two, beginning to understand that the day would not unfold the way I had hoped. I picked up my phone with the faint hope of seeing his name on the screen, a new message saying he was running late, maybe an apology. Instead, the glow of the screen showed me something I wasn't prepared for. Right there in bold letters above a glossy photo was Daniel's Instagram post, "Happy Mother's Day," to my real mom. The picture was unmistakable. My son smiling with his arm around Carol, seated at a table in Le Bernardin in New York. Her hand rested proudly on his, her face lit up as though the world belonged to her. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened. My hands went cold. The sound of laughter around me grew muffled, like I was underwater. Real mom! The words stabbed sharper than any insult. It wasn't just that he wasn't here with me. It was that he had chosen to announce to the world, to all his friends and colleagues and strangers scrolling their feeds, that I was not the one who counted. Carol was... I stared at the post as if it might change if I looked long enough. My reflection in the phone's glass looked older than I had imagined, eyes damp, mouth trembling. He had posted it at 1 o'clock exactly, the time he was supposed to sit across from me here at Romano's. While I sat twisting my napkin, he was toasting another woman and calling her his real mother. The waiter approached again, cautious. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" His eyes flicked to the empty chair, then back to me. I forced a smile, pushing my phone face down. "Yes, thank you. Everything's fine." The lie tasted bitter. I tried to lift my fork again, but my hand wouldn't steady. Memories crashed in too quickly, too painfully. The first day of kindergarten, when he clung to my skirt and whispered, "Don't go, Mommy." The countless evenings I worked extra hours so he could have new sneakers for basketball. The nights he cried over his father's absence, and I held him until he fell asleep. All those years when I believed he knew deep in his bones that I was his mother in every way that mattered. I blinked hard, willing the tears back, but they came anyway, blurring the red dress in my lap, sliding down before I could catch them. I dabbed at my face with the napkin, turning slightly toward the window so no one would notice. But even if they didn't see, I felt exposed, like the entire restaurant could sense my humiliation. At 1:40, I slipped the gift card I'd bought for him back into my purse. My appetite was gone, the salmon untouched. The chair across from me had become unbearable, a silent witness to my rejection. So, around me, waiters were singing Happy Mother's Day to a table of 3 generations of women. The sound of their laughter was the final push. I stood my legs unsteady, leaving a bill on the table, though I hadn't eaten. The waiter called gently after me, "Ma'am, would you like a box for—" I waved him off, unable to form words. Outside, the May sun was too bright. I stepped onto the busy Boston sidewalk, people streaming past with flowers and balloons, arms linked with family. I pulled my cardigan tighter, as if fabric could protect me from the hollowness inside. My phone buzzed once in my purse. I pulled it out quickly, foolishly hoping, but it was nothing more than a promotional email. I opened Daniel's Instagram again as if I needed to punish myself further. Comments poured in. So sweet. She raised such a great son. What a beautiful photo. Carol had replied with hearts and love you, Danny. Each word tightened the knot in my chest. I walked aimlessly down the block heels, clicking on the pavement, my vision still hazy from tears. A little boy ran past holding his mother's hand, laughing, his other hand clutching a drawing of a red heart. The sight made me stumble. I leaned against a lamppost trying to steady myself, but the ache was too deep. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you all right?" A passerby? A young woman with a bouquet glanced at me with concern. I forced another brittle smile. "I'm fine, thank you." The words came out hoarse. She nodded politely and moved on. I turned the corner onto a quieter street away from the noise. My thoughts spiraled. How could he? After everything, after the scraped knees and the college tuition and the nights I stayed awake waiting for him to come home safe, I thought betrayal would come quietly over time, but this was public, loud, permanent. A declaration that I no longer mattered. I found myself at the entrance of a small park, the benches shaded by budding trees. I sat down heavily, staring at the children playing on the swings, their mothers nearby chatting. My own lap felt empty. My hands trembled as I unlocked my phone one last time, staring at his smile in that photo. The smile I used to live for. A tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. Then another. They fell freely now, silent, unstoppable. I pressed the phone face down against my thigh and closed my eyes. Around me, the world moved on. Laughter, traffic, birdsong. But inside me was only a ringing silence, the kind that comes after a door has slammed shut. When I finally stood again, the park seemed too loud, too bright. I walked slowly, each step heavier than the last, until I found myself turning toward home. The red dress clung uncomfortably in the afternoon heat. My purse felt like it carried stones instead of small things. And with each block I understood with sinking clarity that something inside me had cracked open. By the time I reached my front door, my cheeks were dry, but the emptiness had settled deep. I unlocked the door, stepped into the stillness of my apartment, and closed it behind me with a final click. The sound echoed through the quiet rooms, and I leaned back against the wood, letting the tears come once more, alone this time, with no one watching but the walls that had always kept my secrets. I dropped my purse onto the chair and kicked off my shoes, the silence of my apartment pressing in like a weight. The place smelled faintly of lavender detergent, familiar and stale, as if it hadn't noticed that my world had just tilted sideways. On the small table by the door sat a stack of old cards, dusty and bent at the corners. One on top caught my eye. Mother's Day, 3 years ago. The front was bright with tulips, the kind you could buy at any pharmacy checkout. Inside, in Daniel's quick, impatient scrawl, "Thanks, Mom." Daniel. No warmth, no flourish. Just a line scratched out as though fulfilling a duty. I sat heavily in the armchair, holding the card between my fingers. I remembered how I had tucked it away, pretending it meant more than it did, telling myself that he wasn't good with words, that he showed love in other ways. My throat tightened. I couldn't keep lying to myself anymore. The phone buzzed on the table. I snatched it up, my heart absurdly hopeful, even as my gut warned me not to be. A text. "Sorry, Mom got caught up with work. Rain check work. Always work." As if I didn't know exactly where he was smiling over oysters and champagne with Carol in Manhattan. As if I hadn't seen him call her real mom in front of the entire world. The lie was so thin it almost mocked me. My fingers shook as I read it again, then let the phone drop onto the couch cushion. I pressed my palms into my eyes, but the tears still burned. Memories rolled over me, heavy and merciless. Richard's packed suitcase by the door when I was 35, his voice low and unapologetic. "Carol understands me in ways you never did." The door closing behind him. Daniel, only a boy of 11, clutching my waist and asking, "He's coming back, right?" I had told him yes, though I knew it wasn't true. I thought my son and I could survive it together, that he would see me as the one who stayed, the one who fought for him. But now, all these years later, Daniel had chosen the same woman who tore us apart. The apartment felt unbearably small, every wall holding reminders of the life I had built around him. The framed photo of his college graduation, where he'd let me stand beside him for the camera, but turned to beam at Richard afterward. The souvenir mug from a trip to Cape Cod, where I had paid for everything, but he had called his father to say thanks. Every corner seemed to echo with the quiet ways I had been erased. I stood abruptly pacing to the window, the city lights flickering outside. I couldn't keep living this half-life waiting for scraps of attention, pretending that a text once a month meant love. Something inside me had broken wide open at that restaurant, and now the pieces lay scattered. I moved to my desk, opening the laptop that had become more of a bill-paying tool than anything else. The glow of the screen filled the dark room. My fingers hovered over the keys, uncertain. Then I typed flights from Boston to Seattle. The search results spilled across the page, rows of departure times, airlines prices. I didn't even know why I chose Seattle. Maybe because it was far, maybe because I had once seen pictures of its skyline, the Space Needle rising above the mist. It was as good a place as any to start over. My heart pounded as I scrolled. For a long moment, I just stared at the options. The thought of leaving terrified me. Who would I be without this apartment, without the thin tether to Daniel that kept me here? Yet the idea of staying felt worse, like slowly suffocating under the weight of hope that would never be answered. I clicked on a one-way ticket, my breath catching. Leaving in 3 weeks. Enough time to put my affairs in order, sell what I didn't need, and step into the unknown. My finger hovered over confirm purchase. My hand shook. I thought of the red dress crumpled now in the laundry basket, the empty chair at Romano's, the hollow ache of that Instagram post. And I pressed the button. A confirmation email landed in my inbox with a cheerful tone that felt absurd. "We look forward to welcoming you aboard." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen. My chest felt tight, but for the first time all day, not from grief. Something else, something like air filling lungs that had been too long starved. I closed the laptop slowly, the apartment silent again. My eyes fell on the tulip card still lying on the table, Daniel's careless handwriting glaring up at me. I picked it up, walked to the trash can, and dropped it in without ceremony. The sound of the paper hitting the bottom was soft but final. Then I sat down again in the armchair, the exhaustion of the day pulling me under. I didn't cry this time. I just let the stillness settle around me, knowing that for the first time in years, I had chosen something for myself. The night deepened outside, the hum of traffic, a distant backdrop. I closed my eyes, and the image of Seattle, gray skies, a skyline I had never touched, rose up in my mind like a promise I might still be able to keep. The hum of the plane engine was steady, almost soothing, as the lights of Boston faded beneath the clouds. I gripped the armrest not from fear of flying, but from the enormity of what I was doing. A one-way ticket, a city where I knew no one, a future I hadn't planned. When the drink cart came by, the flight attendant, a woman with kind eyes and a neat bun, leaned close as she handed me tea. Her name tag read, Janet Liu. She glanced at the tremor in my hands and said softly, "Going somewhere new." I hesitated, then nodded. "Seattle." She smiled almost knowingly. "Sometimes going alone is how we find ourselves again. Trust me, I've seen it more than once." Her words sank deeper than I expected. I thanked her and held the warm cup, staring out at the endless black sky. For the first time in years, I felt like maybe I wasn't running away, but towards something. When the plane touched down, the Seattle air was cool and damp, a soft mist hanging in the morning light. I pulled my suitcase through the terminal, every step reminding me I was truly on my own now. The taxi ride was quiet, the driver's radio playing faint jazz as the city rolled past glass towers, coffee shops on every corner. the faint outline of the Space Needle through gray clouds. It all felt foreign, almost dreamlike. Grace Harper. The woman renting out the studio met me in front of a weathered brick building in Capitol Hill. She was 58 with silver-streaked hair and a quick, practical smile. "You must be Eleanor," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "Let me show you the place." The studio was small but clean, a single window looking out over a narrow street lined with maples. The kitchen was barely more than a counter with a stove, the bathroom tiny, but it was mine. I dragged my suitcase inside the wheels, squeaking against the hardwood. Grace handed me a stack of papers. "Lease agreement, utilities info. You'll need to set up your own accounts for power and internet. Bank's a block away if you need to open a local account." She must have seen the flicker of overwhelm on my face because she added gently, "It's a lot, but you'll manage. Everyone does their first time." After she left, the silence pressed in. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the papers. Richard had always handled the leases, the bank transfers, the endless little details. Later, Daniel had stepped into that role, taking over bills and accounts, assuring me he'd handle the boring stuff. I had let them, telling myself it was easier that way. Now every blank line waiting for my signature felt like a test. I forced myself to stand, pulling out a pen. One by one, I filled in the lines. Name, address, emergency contact. None. My hand shook at that last part, but I kept going. I walked to the bank that afternoon, rain misting softly on my shoulders. The teller, a young man with a neat beard, smiled as he set up my account. "Any joint holders?" he asked. I shook my head. "Just me." Saying it out loud sent a strange jolt through me. The rest of the day blurred into errands. Waiting at the utility office with strangers clutching folders, signing forms under flickering fluorescent lights, fumbling with my phone to set up online accounts. I must have looked lost more than once, but each time I took a breath and pressed forward. By late afternoon, I found myself back in the studio, keys clutched in one hand, a stack of receipts and paperwork in the other. I dropped everything on the counter and sank onto the bed. The window showed a narrow slice of gray sky, the faint sound of traffic below. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, I exhaled fully. No one had come to rescue me. No one had made the calls or signed the papers. I had done it all myself. A laugh slipped out, small and unexpected. I lay back, the ceiling plain and bare above me, and realized that this was it, my new life. No Daniel, no Carol, no shadow of Richard hovering over me, just me in a city that didn't know my past. The studio was still empty of furniture, the fridge nearly bare, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. I had crossed a line I couldn't go back from, and as frightening as that was, it was also freeing. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of the city outside, and let the thought settle in. For the first time in decades, I wasn't waiting on anyone. I had taken the first step alone. The next morning I wandered down the block, the air damp with drizzle and the scent of coffee drifting from a corner shop. The sign above the door read, "Bennett's Brew," hand-painted in green with a shamrock tucked in the corner. I pushed inside, the bell chiming softly, and was greeted by warmth and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. Behind the counter stood a tall woman with short silver hair and bright blue eyes that carried a spark, despite the lines around them. First time in, she asked, her voice carrying a lilting Irish cadence. "Yes," I said, brushing rain off my sleeves. "I just moved into the neighborhood." "Welcome then," she replied with a smile. "I'm Sophia Bennett, been running this place for 20 years. What'll it be?" I ordered a simple coffee black and took a seat near the window. A few minutes later, she brought it over herself instead of sending a barista. She slid into the chair opposite me without asking. "You've got that look," she said, matter of fact. "What look?" "The look of someone who's carrying more than that suitcase you probably unpacked last night." I blinked at her, startled. Maybe she could see too much. She sipped her own mug and added, "Don't worry, love. I've been there. Divorced at 40, children who didn't speak to me for years. Thought I was invisible. Then I built this place." She gestured around the cafe, its mismatched chairs and walls filled with photos of smiling customers. "Sometimes we start over. Sometimes it's the best thing we ever do." Her words settled over me like a quilt. I found myself telling her haltingly about Boston, about how Daniel had drifted away, though I didn't confess everything yet. She listened without interrupting, nodding slowly. "You'll find your footing here," she said when I finished. "Seattle has a way of giving second chances." I returned to her cafe the next day and the day after. Soon, Sophia began greeting me with, "There's my Boston girl," and sliding a scone onto my plate without charge. It was the first time in weeks I felt seen. One afternoon, as I was nursing my coffee by the window, a young girl approached shyly. She had long dark hair pulled into a braid and carried a backpack that looked heavier than she did. "Excuse me," she said softly, glancing at Sophia, who gave her an encouraging nod. Do you tutor English?" I frowned. "I used to teach, yes." "Why, I'm Isabel Torres," she said quickly. "I'm 18. My mom works with Ms. Bennett. I need help with English so I can graduate. She said maybe you—" Her voice trailed off, hope flickering in her eyes. Something inside me stirred. I hadn't been called Ms. Parker or asked for help in years. "Of course," I said. "I'd be glad to." We began meeting at a small table in the cafe twice a week. At first, Isabel was nervous, stumbling over words, cheeks flushing when she made mistakes. But she was bright, eager, and determined. I found myself slipping back into the rhythm I knew so well. Correcting, gently encouraging, celebrating small victories. One afternoon, she managed to read an entire page without hesitation. She looked up at me, her smile wide. "Thank you, Ms. Eleanor," she said, careful and respectful. The words landed deeper than she could have known. My throat tightened. For the first time in so long, I wasn't invisible, wasn't dismissed. I mattered again. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're doing wonderfully, Isabel. Keep going." She grinned, and Sophia, passing by with a tray of mugs, winked at me. "Looks like you've found your purpose again, love." That night, walking back to my little studio, I realized my steps felt lighter. The city was still unfamiliar, the apartment still echoingly empty, but I carried with me the warmth of two people who saw me as something more than a discarded shadow. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. And for the first time, that was enough. The phone rang just as I was rinsing out my coffee cup, the late afternoon light spilling across my small kitchen. The number was unfamiliar, but the Boston area code made my stomach tighten. I dried my hands and answered, "Eleanor." "It's Donna Miller." I hadn't heard Donna's voice in years, my old neighbor from the street where Daniel grew up. A rush of memories came back. Her waving from her porch, bringing over pies at Thanksgiving. "Donna," I said slowly. "It's been a long time." "I know, dear." "I hope I'm not intruding. I just thought you might want to hear something before it hits the papers. It's about Parker Development." The name alone made my throat go dry. Daniel's company. Yes. Word around Boston is they just lost a huge contract. $85 million if the rumor's right. A downtown project that was supposed to carry them for years. It's gone. Everyone's buzzing. I sank into the chair by the window, the phone pressed hard to my ear. Outside, Seattle's drizzle streaked the glass, but I hardly noticed. 85 million, I repeated almost under my breath. "That's what I heard." Donna continued. "People are saying the board is restless. Some blame Daniel's leadership. Others whisper, Carol's been meddling, and Richard's been showing up at meetings like he's still in charge. It's messy, Eleanor. Real messy." I closed my eyes, listening to her voice carry the words I had never expected to hear. "Baen." For so long, Daniel's world seemed untouchable. Gleaming buildings, magazine features, gala dinners with Carol on his arm. He had built a fortress of success, and I had been left standing outside its gates. And now, cracks were beginning to show. "Are you all right?" Donna asked after a pause. "Yes," I answered, steadying my voice. "Thank you for telling me." We caught up briefly, her chatter about grandchildren and garden clubs before I promised to stay in touch. When the call ended, I set the phone down slowly, my hands trembling, not from sadness but something sharper. I pictured Daniel in his office, the skyline of Boston behind him jaw tight as the board demanded answers. I imagined Carol perfectly dressed trying to soothe him in public while whispering fears in private. Richard older now but still ambitious, hovering close, desperate to keep his grip on the life he chose over me decades ago. For a moment I almost pitied them. Almost. Then I remembered the Instagram post, the words "real mom" glowing across my screen, the hollow seat at Romano's, the years of silence from Daniel when I needed him most. Any trace of pity hardened quickly into something else. A bitter smile crept to my lips, unbidden. Not triumphant, not joyful. Just sharp and weary. Life had a way of circling back, of demanding its due. I hadn't lifted a finger and already the walls of their perfect little empire were starting to shake. I stood and crossed the room to the small mirror above my dresser. My reflection stared back, older, lined, tired, but steadier than I had felt in years. "This is only the beginning," I whispered, though there was no one to hear it. The rain outside deepened, tapping against the window like a quiet drumbeat. I wrapped my cardigan tighter, carrying the weight of the news with me, letting it settle into my bones. The world was shifting, and for once it wasn't against me. The message came through in the early evening, just as I was stacking books on the little shelf in my studio. A Seattle number I didn't recognize lit up my phone, followed by a text. "Eleanor, this is Carol. I'm in town. Please can we meet Westin Hotel lobby tomorrow at noon?" For a long moment I just stared at the screen. Carol, the woman who had stepped into my marriage, who had slid into Daniel's life so easily he called her real mom for the world to see. Part of me wanted to delete the message and pretend it never arrived. But curiosity, and something colder, kept me from doing it. The next day I walked into the Westin, the glass doors sliding open to a polished lobby with marble floors and soft piano music. Carol was already there, sitting rigidly in an armchair, a silk scarf tied carefully at her throat. She looked smaller than I remembered her posture, still elegant, but her eyes tired. "Eleanor," she said, standing quickly as though afraid I might walk back out. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from her, my hands folded in my lap. "Why are you here?" She hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "Daniel is not well. He's been drinking, barely sleeping. The company is bleeding money after that lost contract, and the board is circling. He's angry, unpredictable. She broke off her fingers, tightening around her handbag. "He needs his mother." I let the words hang between us, watching her. For years, she had been the one on his arm, the one smiling in photographs, the one he chose over me. And now she was here asking me to step back into the role he had publicly handed to her. "His mother," I repeated softly. "That's interesting." She winced. "Eleanor, please. I know we've had our differences, but Daniel is breaking. I can't reach him. Richard can't either. He won't listen to anyone." I held her gaze, my voice calm, almost detached. "On Mother's Day. Carol, he posted a picture of you. Do you remember what he wrote?" Her lips pressed together. She didn't answer. "He called you his real mom." I let the words linger, sharp and deliberate. "So forgive me if I don't quite understand why you're sitting here asking me to fix what you both built. If Daniel chose you, then he chose everything that comes with you. Let him call on his real mom now." Her face paled, and for a second I thought she might cry. Instead, she straightened her composure, slipping back into place like a mask. "You're colder than I expected." I almost laughed. Cold. "No. I'm tired, Carol. Tired of being the backup plan. Tired of waiting to be acknowledged after years of sacrifice. If Daniel wants to drown in the choices he made, I can't stop him. And I won't try." The silence between us thickened, the piano music from across the lobby suddenly distant. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally, she stood adjusting her scarf with trembling hands. "I shouldn't have come," she said quietly. "No," I replied, rising to my feet. "You shouldn't have." I walked past her toward the doors, the cool air rushing in as they slid open. Behind me, I could feel her eyes following, but I didn't look back. For the first time, I wasn't the one left standing in the lobby begging for scraps of dignity. Outside, the Seattle sky was gray as ever, the air damp with mist. I drew my coat tighter around me and stepped into the street, the echo of Carol's plea still lingering in my ears. Yet beneath it all, a steady calm had settled in me. Daniel had chosen his real mom. And now at last they could both live with the weight of that choice. He was already there when I stepped into Bennett's Brew, hunched in the farthest booth, like a shadow that didn't belong in the warm, clinking rhythm of morning coffee. The sight of him made my breath catch, not because I hadn't imagined this moment, but because the man sitting there wasn't the Daniel I remembered. His once carefully styled hair was unkempt, his tailored shirts replaced by something wrinkled and too loose. He looked thinner, as if the last year had hollowed him out from the inside. His eyes, once so quick to judge, now carried something more raw, something almost afraid. "Hi," he said when I approached, standing awkwardly, unsure whether to hug me. He didn't. I slid into the booth opposite him. "You found me," I asked Donna. "She said you come here most mornings." Of course he had gone to her. That same old pattern. When things fall apart, find the woman who will fix it. First Carol, now circling back to me. Sophia raised an eyebrow at me from behind the counter. I gave her a slight shake of my head. "Not now." Daniel wrapped his hands around a coffee cup that looked untouched. I've lost a lot," he said finally. I said nothing. The Beacon Tower project collapsed. Investors pulled out after the contract loss. Then the mortgage payments on the house in Brookline. Well, the bank finally came. Carol and Dad, they're not even speaking to each other. He blames her for pushing too far and she blames him for being weak. His voice cracked and he looked down at the table. I stayed in that house alone for a while. Until I couldn't. I let the words pass over me. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered buying him his first winter coat in Brookline, one he outgrew too fast. That house had once been my dream. Now it was just another pile of debt and silence. "I don't have anyone left," he said, softer now. "Everyone's gone. And I need you, Mom." My throat tightened, but I didn't look away. "You need me," I echoed. "Yes." He met my eyes finally. I know what I did. I was wrong. I see it now. You were always there. I didn't appreciate it. I thought success meant something else. I don't know what I thought. There it was. The apology I'd longed for, and yet it didn't land the way I expected. It was too late, too worn out, too surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. "You don't love me," I said quietly. "You need me." "There's a difference." He flinched. "You don't miss me because I'm your mother." I continued. "You miss having someone who won't let you drown. But you already threw away the life raft, Daniel. You chose someone else. You made it clear who mattered to you." He shook his head, reaching across the table, but I pulled my hands into my lap. "I was stupid," he said. "You can't imagine how many nights I've wished I could take that post down, take it all back." "No," I said. "You don't get to erase it. You don't get to edit out the woman who stood by you your whole life until you decided she wasn't good enough for Instagram." He looked down again. His shoulders sagged, and for a moment I saw not the CEO, not the son I raised, but a man who had finally run out of places to hide. "I'm not asking you to fix everything," he said after a long pause. I thought maybe you'd still care." I looked at him for a long moment. "I do care," I said. "But caring doesn't mean I can save you from your consequences. That's love, Daniel, not a free pass." He nodded slowly, as if the words took a moment to settle. Outside, the street was waking up. Buses passing footsteps on wet pavement, the world carrying on as usual. Sophia came over silently, and set a fresh cup of tea in front of me. She glanced at Daniel but said nothing. Her presence was quiet, grounding. Daniel stood finally, his eyes rimmed red. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know," I replied. He didn't hug me. I didn't offer one. He walked out into the Seattle rain without an umbrella, his figure disappearing into the mist, and I sat in that booth, staring at the cup he left untouched. I didn't cry. I just breathed. Outside, the clouds hung low, but somehow I felt lighter. The knock came just after lunch, sharp and professional, the kind of knock that expected to be answered quickly. I opened the door to a man in a crisp navy suit, mid-30s, holding a sleek leather briefcase, and wearing the polite expression of someone used to getting his way. "Mrs. Parker?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, though my instincts were already bristling. "I'm David Klein. I represent Parker Development Group. Daniel asked me to speak with you about some legal matters. He didn't ask to come in, but I stepped aside anyway out of habit, more than invitation." He entered with that same efficient air, scanning my modest studio as if cataloging its insignificance. "I'll keep this brief," he said, setting his briefcase on the counter and clicking it open. "Given recent financial pressures on the company, we're working to liquidate certain assets and minimize tax exposure. Your name remains on the deed to the Brookline property, and Daniel needs your cooperation in transferring the title and settling some outstanding tax obligations." I stared at him for a moment, then gave a short, humorless laugh. "You flew all the way to Seattle for this." "Actually, I was in Portland for another case," he said smoothly, sliding a stack of documents toward me. "I thought it best to handle this in person. I didn't touch the papers. And what exactly does cooperation look like here?" He tapped the top page. "Just a signature, really. You'd be relinquishing any lingering claim to the property. In exchange, the company covers all filing costs and, frankly, it keeps things cleaner for everyone involved." I looked at the neat lines, the legal language, the carefully drafted detachment. Once I had signed school forms for Daniel with a heart drawn next to my name, now they wanted me to sign away the last physical piece of a life I built brick by brick. "I'll need to speak with my lawyer," I said. David raised his brows slightly as if surprised. "That's not really necessary. These are standard documents." "I didn't ask if they were standard," I said calmly. "I said I'll speak with my lawyer." He adjusted his tie. "Mrs. Parker, this isn't personal. We're just trying to close loose ends. The IRS is involved. There are timelines to consider. I'm aware," I said, stepping forward and meeting his eyes. "And you should be aware that legal timelines don't override personal boundaries, especially when the people pushing them are the same ones who once told me I was no longer part of their family." His jaw tightened just enough to betray discomfort. I continued, my voice steady. "Tell Daniel I'm not obstructing anything. I'm simply exercising the same independence he encouraged when he walked away. I will not be rushed, bullied, or guilted into cleaning up his financial mess. Not without proper counsel. And certainly not out of some fated obligation to a son who made his choices clear." David hesitated, then began gathering the documents. "I understand," he said, though his tone held a trace of irritation. I walked to the door and opened it for him. "Thank you for stopping by." He looked like he wanted to say more. Perhaps argue, perhaps convince. But something in my posture must have told him it wouldn't work. He nodded curtly and stepped into the hallway. As I closed the door behind him, a surprising calm washed over me. There was a time I would have second-guessed myself, would have reread those documents a dozen times, hoping to find the right answer. But not now. Not anymore. The papers sat untouched on the counter. I left them there, poured myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The world outside went on. Rain clouds drifting slowly past rooftops, voices rising from the sidewalk below. I had said no. Not in anger, not in fear, but in full knowledge of my worth, and that I thought was the real power they never expected me to claim. The newspaper was folded neatly on the counter at Bennett's Brew next to the register. I wasn't looking for it. In fact, I had come in early that morning just to sit by the window, grade a few of Isabel's practice essays, and enjoy a quiet cup of Earl Grey. But the headline was impossible to ignore. From Manhattan's real estate star to total collapse, The Rise and Fall of Daniel Parker, by Marcus Lee, business correspondent. My breath caught for a second, not from surprise but from the strange gravity of seeing it in print. There it was, laid out in black and white, all of it. I picked up the paper, slowly walked it to my table in the corner, and sat down. My tea had gone cold. The article pulled no punches. Marcus Lee was thorough. He chronicled the meteoric rise of Parker Development Group from boutique brownstone renovations in Brooklyn to skyscraper partnerships across Manhattan. Glossy investor spreads, luxury events with Carol at Daniel's side, glowing reviews in the business magazines. And then, contracts unraveling debt, mounting mismanagement buried beneath bravado. The line that caught me came near the end. Sources close to the company suggest a fatal over-reliance on personal charisma and family branding. When that image cracked, so did the foundation beneath it. I stared at that sentence for a long while. Family branding. That was me, wasn't it? The silent figure in the background for so many years. Then replaced, then discarded. Sophia came over and placed a fresh cup of tea beside me. She said nothing, just squeezed my shoulder gently and returned to the counter. The article continued: a withdrawn investor lawsuit properties left half-finished layoffs across 3 states. Marcus even mentioned Carol, though not by name, as the personal advisor and stepmother turned co-founder who quietly exited last quarter. Richard wasn't mentioned at all. He never was when it came to blame. I folded the paper, closed fingers lingering on the rough edge of the page. I didn't feel glee. This wasn't revenge, not really. What I felt was air, space, freedom. For the first time in a very long time, my name wasn't entangled with theirs. I wasn't being called for a bailout, for a favor, for a quiet signature on the dotted line. I wasn't being used as an emotional anchor to steady their crumbling ships. I was just Eleanor Parker, living in a modest studio apartment, drinking tea in a cafe run by someone who knew my name for the right reasons. Daniel would face questions now. Real ones. From journalists, creditors, maybe even regulators. Carol would retreat behind closed doors, shielded by her curated dignity. Richard, I imagined, would simply vanish. He always had a knack for exiting when consequences came knocking. I watched people pass outside the cafe window. Students in hoodies, an older couple walking their dog, a young barista from the bakery down the block laughing into her phone. Life moving forward. The world hadn't ended. I wasn't ruined. And karma. Karma didn't shout. It didn't knock on your door in the middle of the night. It published a headline. Quiet. Public. Unavoidable. I sipped my tea and let the warmth settle into me. No more chasing, no more explaining. The weight I carried for years had finally shifted off my shoulders and exactly where it belonged. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, I stood at the whiteboard in room 2B of the Maplewood Community Center, marker in hand, facing a group of wide-eyed students from all walks of life. Some were young mothers from Honduras. Others were older men from Vietnam or Morocco. Their hands calloused, their eyes full of quiet determination. Today, I said, writing the word carefully in green, we're learning how to express gratitude. A few heads nodded. I watched as one woman, Lynn, wrote the word in her notebook, mouthing the sounds. In that moment, something inside me softened. Not out of pity, out of recognition. They weren't here for grades or degrees. They were here to rebuild one sentence at a time, like I was. After class, one of the students, a young man named Arturo, lingered to ask about American job interviews. Another, Maria, brought me a small homemade pastry wrapped in wax paper. Gracias, Miss Eleanor, she whispered, her voice trembling but proud. I thanked her and tucked the pastry into my bag. It wasn't about the food. It was about the offering. In the afternoons, I often walked to the library and sat at the same desk by the window. There I began something I hadn't done in years. I wrote. Not emails, not bills, not checklists. I wrote about my days, my thoughts, my past. The journals were simple, lined paper, spiral bound. But they became a kind of anchor. Sometimes the entries were long, winding things full of memory and ache. Other times they were no more than a line I no longer feel invisible. Sophia convinced me to submit a short essay to the center's community newsletter. They published it under the headline, "The Courage to Begin Again." The next week, an older woman with gray braids approached me at the grocery store. "Are you Eleanor? I read your piece. It made me feel not so alone. Recognition like that used to scare me. Now it felt like breathing. Isabel visited me almost every weekend. She had finished high school, was applying to college, and had started calling me Coach Eleanor, half joking, half adoring. We met at Bennett's Brew and sometimes just walked the lake trails in silence, letting the rhythm of our steps do the talking. One Saturday, she burst into my apartment holding a brochure. "Look, I got into Seattle Community College. ESL tutoring work study too." I hugged her tightly. "That's wonderful. I couldn't have done it without you." "You did the work, Isabel." She shook her head, smiling. "You showed me how. You didn't just teach me English. You taught me how to show up even when it's hard." I felt my throat tighten. Later that day, we were sitting by the window in my little kitchen, sun spilling across the table. Isabel looked at me with that same searching gaze she'd had when she was still shy and unsure. "You've changed, you know," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Changed how you're—" "I don't know." "Lighter?" "You smile with your whole face now. You talk like you're not afraid someone's listening. You used to carry something heavy. I could feel it. But now—" She paused, then said softly, "Now you look like you're really you." I didn't answer right away. I just nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. She was right. Somewhere along the way, between that quiet cafe table and the classroom full of eager eyes, between the rejection and the reclamation, I had found my way back to myself. Not as someone's wife, not as someone's mother, but as someone— I reached for my journal later that night and wrote just one sentence. I am no longer rebuilding from what I lost. I am building from who I am. Then I closed the book, turned off the light, and let sleep come easily. Spring arrived quietly in Seattle that year, with cherry blossoms blooming along the sidewalks, and a softness in the air that wrapped itself around my mornings. I had settled into a rhythm. Early walks, tea at Sophia's cafe, teaching my Tuesday and Thursday classes, journaling on the bench by the lake. It had been a full year since Mother's Day, the day Daniel called someone else his real mom. And yet when I thought about it now, there was no sting left. Just distance, like a story I once read aloud too many times to ever forget, but no longer needed to keep on my shelf. Daniel hadn't reached out again. I heard through quiet whispers from Boston that the company had officially dissolved. Richard and Carol's divorce had finalized 2 months earlier, each blaming the other for a house of cards that finally collapsed. And Daniel. Last I knew, he'd moved to Florida. Or Arizona. The details didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I hadn't followed him. Instead, I'd built a life here. Small, maybe, but solid. Real. At the community center, the staff gave me a small plaque after my 6-month volunteer milestone. "To Ms. Eleanor, who teaches us more than English. She teaches us how to begin again." I didn't cry, though. I came close. Isabel stopped by that same afternoon, dropping off her spring class schedule. "Coach Eleanor," she said with a grin, "you're on my reference list for every scholarship app." I laughed. "That's a lot of pressure." "You can handle it," she replied. "You taught me to—" Later, as I sat by the window journaling, I caught my reflection in the glass. Older, yes, with soft lines carved by sorrow and strength. But I also saw something else, clarity. Not the version of myself Daniel once ignored. Not the woman Carol dismissed with a smile. Someone deeper. Someone whole. There was a time when I believed motherhood meant pouring yourself into others until nothing was left. That the only way to matter was to be needed, but need fades. What lasts is how you show up for yourself, when no one is watching, when no one says thank you. My son once called another woman his real mom, but I became the real mom of my own life. Not perfect, not saintly, just present, healing, honest. So if you've ever been forgotten, left behind, dismissed, made to feel invisible, please hear me now. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to live for yourself, not out of bitterness, but out of love. Because when you do, you don't just reclaim your worth. You become the true mother of your own story. And that more than any title is something no one can ever take from you.